When I was a kid, I was a fan of Marvel. And one of my favorite heroes was from Greenwich Village, namely Doctor Strange. Recently, they made a movie about him. And also in the Avengers, he was one of the star players in the Avengers, the most recent Avengers movie. All right, so much for that. But yeah, he was one of my childhood heroes. That might surprise you to hear me say that. But now, Hollywood got off to a good start here. Hollywood got its start. Movie going became popular. My dad told me, and a few books mentioned, if your mother were rich, she could give you a dime. And with a dime, you could go to the movie, pay for the ticket, buy a soft drink and a bag of popcorn and possibly a hot dog too. All for a dime. If your mother weren't rich, she'd give you a nickel and all you could do is pay for the ticket. But most of the time when I take my family to a movie, I say, now, I'm not going to buy anything but the tickets. For one thing, movie theater food is not what my doctor wants me to be eating, I'll put it that way. My doctor does not approve of the type of stuff they sell, except for the popcorn maybe. But the other stuff, my doctor does not want me eating. When you get to be in your late 60s, like I am, you've got to be careful about these things. When you're young, I mean, you don't stop eating candy bars, I mean, completely, when you're young. But when you get older, unless your doctor tells you, like if you have diabetes or something, that's something else. All right. A lot of writers did not like the country, the way it was headed. They said the music is jazz, the music is just it appeals to the basest of human instincts. The writing was the dime novel. I mean, where literally you could go to a bookstore and buy a 200-page novel for a dime. Cheap novels, the dime novel. All right. Some other heroes of the 1920s. These are men my dad grew up with, you might say, or maybe they were his heroes. I want to ask you, I heard of a ball player one time who had struck out 2,200 times. Now, who would want a ball player who struck out 2,200 times? Anybody know who I'm thinking about? If you read the lesson, you might. Who'd want a ball player who had struck out? This ball player's name was George. You probably have heard of him, but not by that name. George Herman Ruth, otherwise known as Babe Ruth. Now, some of you might have heard of him. Now, what made him strike out? Well, a new ball had been invented that was harder than the old balls and would travel farther. So, Babe Ruth then, unlike the old players, some of them would actually put their hands like this on a bat apart, and they would just try to meet the ball with the bat and put the ball into play. And if they could put the ball into play, and they'd hit singles. Today, 70% of your hits are singles. In those days, 85% of your hits are singles, and most of your hits out of them were doubles. No, Babe Ruth put his hands together, and when he swung like lightning, and he missed a lot. But when he connected, that ball flew. Today, almost every ball player in the big leagues is a copy of Babe Ruth. Those big league ball players, yes, they strike out a lot. I mean, just watch a game. But again, they've learned when they connect. But I want to say this, though, about Babe Ruth. The ball field, the Yankee Stadium that he built, he was left-handed. If you know anything about the game of baseball, that meant most of the balls he hit went to right field. The left field fence was 450 feet from home plate. The right field fence was close in. Do you have any idea why he hit 730 home runs? Well, 714 home runs. The Yankees. Now, granted, Babe Ruth had to play half his games in another field. Eventually, I mean, this was still going on, folk, when I was a kid, and men like Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris were hitting easy home runs. Eventually, the other teams in the league protested and got these Yankees to build a stadium that was more equitable, put the right field fence farther back, and bring the left field fence in, and build a stadium that was more fair. Not only was Babe Ruth left-handed, but so was his teammate Lou Gehrig. And again, Lou Gehrig had an easy time popping home runs out. If it doesn't sound fair, it really wasn't. But that was the way the Yankees played ball. Babe Ruth has been called the boy who never really grew up, boisterous. For a while, he was a heavy drinker. But he finally quit his drinking when he saw it was affecting his playing. He quit drinking. The mayor of New York pled with him with tears. Please, babe, you're looked up to by the young men of America. You're setting a bad example. Babe Ruth started crying himself. He promised, I will not drink anymore. And he didn't. As for the mayor of New York, he should have taken his own advice. He became an alcoholic himself. But anyway, now another star of the age was Jack Dempsey, professional boxer. He finally was defeated. That happens to almost all professional boxers. Today we have a lot of ex-champs around, and one of them lives right here in Atlanta, Evander Holyfield by name. And Evander Holyfield, what used to be his mansion, was close to my wife's home before we were married, that is, and we passed by it every time we visited her parents. He doesn't own that mansion anymore. The bank repossessed it. Today, Evander Holyfield is broke. Mike Tyson is another ex-champ. As broke as Evander Holyfield, if not more so. All that money gone up in smoke. All right. Joe Louis, in case you wonder, he came later. Joe Louis was a black man. When they finally started allowing black people into sports, nobody alive could stay in the ring with Joe Louis. He finally was defeated himself. All these people eventually get defeated except for, there was one who retired undefeated, and I can't think of his name right now, back in the 1950s, if any of you know who I'm talking about. Anyway, but these are boxing heroes. Anyway, another hero at the time was a man named Charles Lindbergh. He flew in a plane called the Spirit of St. Louis. Spirit of St. Louis, and he wrote a book about it called We. We was me and my plane. Now, other men had tried to fly across the Atlantic before, and they all disappeared. Apparently, their plane fell in the ocean, never seen or heard from again. But now, if any of you know anything about how you fly across the Atlantic, fly from New York to Paris, the shortest route, due to the fact that the Earth is round, the shortest route is above the Arctic Circle. In other words, it can get quite cold. Well, Lindbergh found his plane covered over with ice. He was only 6 feet above the waves, and try as he might, he could not gain altitude. So he ran the risk of losing fuel. So he finally drifted south a little bit to try to get the ice to melt. He finally did get the ice to melt, and he was able to gain altitude as the ice melted. But he almost ran out of fuel, again, because he had to use extra fuel because the weight, ice is heavy, folks. Especially you get ice on the wings of the plane, it's really, really heavy. Today we have de-icers on a plane that can use the heat from the engine to de-ice the wings of a plane, but Lindbergh did not have that. But by the way, his Spirit of St. Louis is now in the Smithsonian Institute of Washington. His plane, and the Smithsonian is free. You can get in for free and see that plane, the Wright brothers plane, a model of Amelia Earhart's plane, as well as some of the capsules that went to the moon and back. All this is on display at the Smithsonian. There was no television yet. All right, your books will say that if you research, the television was been in 1920, but commercial television did not come into widespread use till the late 1940s. In the 1930s, there were a few stations, but they'd only broadcast a few hours a day and then go off the air. But the television, the commercial television was not in use, so the radio was in use. And the radios in those days would tune in shortwave, and you could get stations from Europe. And Americans would sometimes listen to Adolf Hitler give a speech. Again, today, most of your AM radios today do not tune in shortwave. If you want to, you can get one that does. I have 2 radios at home that still tunes in shortwave. No, 3. 3 radios that tunes in shortwave. City and country, oh yeah, did not like each other, at odds with each other. But for the first time in American history, the city folk outnumbered the country folk. Immigration was greatly curtailed. Now, Saco and Vanzetti. These were two Italian immigrants. Yeah. They were tried for a crime that some people believe they never committed, and they were executed. Mostly, the reason we mention it, I mean, your book mentions it, this event made the newspapers, and every newspaper in the country printed about it. It was the talk of the radio shows. It was the talk of people in the marketplace, the talk of people who met with each other. It was big, big news at the time. What made it so big news was a lot of the people believed they were innocent. Well, why were they executed? A lot of people believed they were executed because they were immigrants and they were foreign. And in those days, a foreigner was guilty by accusation. You're accused, you're guilty. Whether or not they were guilty, in my research, I've not been able to determine. I do know that they get a lot of sympathy from historians. But they were executed for a crime that they might not have committed. Now, Scopes. Scopes trial. All right, I've asked this to some of my classes. I want to ask you this one. How many of you were taught evolution either in high school or college? How many of you have been taught evolution by your teachers? Only 2 hands went up. That's typical. In the other class, it was about 4 or 5. I've seen classes like this one. Only 2 hands will go up. Today's teachers are reluctant to teach evolution. Why, folk? It can't be they're afraid of getting fired. No teacher in this country can be fired for teaching evolution. It can't happen. Then why don't the teachers teach it? Because they have become painfully aware that the facts have gone completely contrary to evolution these days. And there'll be students in the class who can show them up if they try to bring it up. I mean, I've been shown up, I've been embarrassed in front of my classes, and it's no fun, I'll tell you. But the facts have gone completely. Now, in 1960, we were told that evolution was a proven fact and we had to accept it. But the last 55 or 60 years have not at all been kind to the theory. As more and more has been dug up, I mean, hey, when I was in school, I minored in biology. I have an undergraduate minor in biology. What was DNA? DNA was some acid, deoxynucleic acid, RNA, ribonucleic acid. We didn't quite know what it was. Then eventually we found, hey, these acids have a lot to do with heredity. Then we found they have everything to do with heredity. The role of DNA for all practical purposes, folks, disproves evolution. I want to ask you, if you study the DNA of diverse animals or plants, you'll find that an animal, for instance, one type of animal might have a DNA for eye color on chromosome 1, a gene, and another animal have a DNA for eye color on chromosome number 6. How does a gene move from one chromosome to another? And I'll give you a strong hint. I don't have any idea. But if any of you know, if a gene actually moves, folk, it happens from one chromosome to another, the creature comes out as hopelessly deformed. And yet, how do you get a chromosome moving from, a gene moving one chromosome to another, or even a chromosome changing places to where chromosome number 1 in another animal is similar to chromosome number 7 in a different animal? How do chromosomes change places without the offspring becoming seriously formed? I'll give you another hint. I don't know. DNA has shown us that the only way an ape could have produced a human was two apes would have mated one day, and you had to produce a human that had at least 60 million changes from parent to offspring. Now, not only that, but every one of these changes would have to be workable change. In other words, not just change to make for a deformed creature where its inner organs would be outside its body. I mean, a workable creature. And then it would have to have a member of the opposite sex born close enough by to where the two of them would meet and carry on that new species that were formed. Multiply, and it might be as we discover more about the ape DNA that we'll find there actually have to be more changes than that. And folk, it looks like it would have to happen instantly in a one generation. There it is. The parents were apes. The children, at least one male and one female, were human. Or in the case of reptiles becoming birds, the parents were birds. The parents were reptiles. The next generation, birds. With millions of changes occurring in their genes, all in one swoop. You might say, couldn't it happen gradually? Well, if it did, for every change that was made, you'd have to have a member of the opposite sex that had the same change. Now, am I teaching science or am I teaching theology, folk? I had a pupil accuse me of teaching theology right at this time when I gave this part of the lecture. All right, now back to 1925. The Scopes trial had to do with the teaching of evolution. It occurred in Dayton, Tennessee. I went to college in Cleveland, Tennessee, so Dayton is close to Cleveland. Scopes trial was about, a teacher named Scopes was accused of teaching evolution. We now have learned he probably didn't, but he was accused of it. So he was tried for a crime, the crime of because teaching of evolution had been outlawed. He was tried for the crime. The crime became a circus where the state called on William Jennings Bryan, who'd already he's been Secretary of State, and he had been, Bryan, run for president 3 times. But William Jennings Bryan was not a scientist. He was not qualified. There were a lot of better answers given than the ones he gave. Anyway, the state called Bryan. In the meantime, Clarence Darrow was called on to defend, I won't even write his name. Darrow was called on as a defense attorney. And the two men got into an argument over the Bible. And the argument degenerated to ridiculous levels, to say the least. If you watch any movies, there have been several movies made about the Scopes trial. The movies all picture Bryan as being made a complete fool of and a complete dunce of. If you actually read the word-for-word transcripts of the trial, the victory for science was not that pronounced. Nevertheless, science has claimed a victory from that day till this. All right, I want to ask in this class, when does any matter of scientific inquiry become so proven that nobody will ever question it again? When does this happen in a field of science?
Never.
I may have asked you this before. It never happens. Never. But I had a girl this last semester say, are you familiar with the Scopes trial? I said, very much so. She acted like the Scopes trial proved the issue. An issue of scientific inquiry is never proven, especially when you have two men who are not scientists arguing on an argument on a child's level. I heard a preacher one time not too long ago say, when you have a wise person arguing with a fool, you can't tell after a while which person is wise and which one's the fool. They both degenerate to, it's the type of thing you try to avoid, folk. Neither one of them knew enough about what they were talking about to really make for a good argument. Nevertheless, the Scopes trial made the news. All right. This takes us up to Al Smith. Al Smith ran for president in 1928. Oh, yes. Here is a story. Calvin Coolidge had already served 5.5 years. He could have run again, but he chose not to. I always throw this in. Now, Calvin Coolidge is the only president we've had who claimed to be part Indian. And one day, Calvin Coolidge went to a reservation to visit supposedly his Indian cousins. An Indian shaman said to him, "Mr. President, I foresee 7 years bad luck." Calvin Coolidge listened, didn't say a word. Another Indian said, "If white stone-faced leader am in office, him will be blamed when the trouble comes." Did Calvin Coolidge know the Depression was coming? Whatever. He got out of office pretty fast. Now another thing too, he had a son who died while he was in the White House. He died of blood poisoning. A lot of sympathy poured out. Now my dad had a sister who died of blood poisoning about the same time, 11 years old. And my dad taught us to be afraid of polio and blood poisoning and all that stuff, which, I mean, those diseases were really, really tough diseases, strong diseases in those days. But anyway, well, if you watch the video from the last lecture, somehow this camera got zoomed in tight and the video is utterly worthless. But the audio is still good. But the video is kind of worthless. All right, anyway, Al Smith ran on a Democrat. Herbert Hoover ran on the Republicans. In view of the prosperity of the time, no Democrat had a chance. The Democrats might have been better off running Al Smith than they could have run anyone else, and he probably picked up votes. Al Smith picked up a whole lot of city votes and got the cities kind of voting together. Al Smith also picked up the immigrant vote more than any immigrant before him. So and he also picked up the poor vote, more so than anyone else, but he didn't have a chance. Now here's what a lot of people say hurt Al Smith. My mother was not quite 6 years old when Al Smith lost the election, born in 1922, the election of her. But my mother would tell me for years, particularly in 1960. In 1960 we had another Catholic running. All right, Al Smith was a Catholic. Al Smith was the first Catholic to run for president. My mother would say he got nowhere. Well, he was beaten by a landslide, but then again, I'm not sure it was his Catholicism that lost for him, as the fact is that nobody could have beaten Herbert Hoover. I mean, he was looked on as being a decent Republican, self-respecting man. Herbert Hoover was a businessman. And I remember my high school history teacher said, "We've never had another businessman president." That was true until now. Our present president is also a businessman, but Herbert Hoover was a businessman. All right. Anyway, Smith was beaten pretty badly. His Roman Catholic religion probably did a lot to hurt him, but then it might have helped him more than it hurt him. Some historians have said that. Herbert Hoover ran on a Republican ticket. He won easily. All right, now, again, he seemed right for the times. Herbert Hoover was not a good speech maker, but I'm going to try to mimic him as much as I can. Herbert Hoover, in his inaugural address, here's what he said. He said, "There will be 2 chickens in every pot. There will be 2 cars in every garage." Isn't it wonderful? He said, "Americans today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us." In other words, we're on our way to prosperity that would not quit. Oh. But underneath, all right, here's something my dad said. My dad was born in July 1920. He was 8 years old when Hoover was elected. He was 9 years old when the stock market crash occurred. But he always said to the day he died, and this is the first history book I've seen that will seem to verify, he always said that the Depression was actually here long before the stock market crash of 1929, but people were too proud to admit it. But your book says that 2 people, your farmer and your factory worker, and we still had a lot of farmers and a lot of factory workers in the country, they were living in very deep poverty long before the Depression hit. Prices of farm products had gone down after the war, and especially, here's what really hurt the farmer. He was told, now, if you buy these tractors, if you buy this tractor and you buy this plow, and if you buy this reaper and you buy this combine, all these farm gadgets, you can get rich off of that land you have. They bought the tractors and they plowed every acre they got and put their produce on the market and found that there were too many other farmers and the price of the food went down and down and down farther. And the farmer went, hey, how come? I used to get so much for my produce and now I'm getting nothing. Someone began to realize it was because they were overproducing. But then again, the farmer, tell a farmer, produce less, produce less. He said, well, hey, I'm not getting anything for what I am producing. So the farmer produced too much. The result was he did not get much for his produce. The factory worker, here's what factories did to them. When the factory made a profit, what the factory should have done was paid out the profits to the dividends, and as dividends to shareholders, and paid it out in higher wages to the workers. If they'd have done this, folk, if they would have, the factory worker could have bought more products. If they would have, the people who got the dividends could have bought more product also. The Depression might have been averted. As it was, factories kept on building bigger factories and producing more. The result was they made more than they could sell. And right at this minute, in this country, right now, our automobile countries have done the same thing. Produced a whole lot of cars that are sitting on the lots, unsold. Are any of you aware of this? And they're good cars too. Good cars. Today's cars, I can't tell how much better they are than cars were when I was a kid. When I was a kid, this month, it's the transmission went out. You get that thing, next month it's a universal joint. If you don't know what you run anyway, they would break. Next month you'd have to buy a couple of tires. Month after that, replace a headlight or two, or a turn signal light. Next month, if you get the point, it was something breaking down, even the newer cars, something tearing up about them all the time, and you had to soak money in them constantly. Today's cars, they're much, much better. And oh yes, the old cars, the temperature drops down to 10 degrees above zero or colder. That's the sound they would make when you try to start them. Click, 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 click. Today's cars, temperature gets down to 15 below zero and they start right up, no problem, and drive off with them. Oh yeah, much better. But yet, the car companies are putting them out, and one reason they're not selling is people are holding on to their old cars because they're better. And also the new cars, they're better quality, but they are not cheap. I can remember when a new car would cost $2,000 or $3,000. I paid $2,500 for my first new car. Can't do that today. All right, stock prices. Oh yeah, now folk, watch out. When you see the stock going this, giving it this, and you're in that stock, what had you better do?
Sell.
Get out.
Sell.
It can't keep doing this forever and ever. It can't. Sooner or later, people are going to, it's overpriced, it's going to top off. The way you handle the stock market is when everybody else is getting out, you look for an entry. And you enter when you think it's going to go up, but you enter low. When it's doing this and everybody else is getting in, that's when you get out. That's the way to handle the market. Well, people in those days were thinking the stock market will go up forever. It's always going up. Books were written about it. And people were buying on margin. That is, if they had $300, they were buying $600 worth of stock. Their broker would own them $300. And I guess what the bad thing about that is until your $300 has earned $600, you're not really not earning because you owe your broker the first $300. Now, when if you put in $300 and borrowed another $300, when that stock goes up to $600, you can pay your broker back. And finally, you're making money of your own. Generally, you don't buy on margin, but people were buying on margin. It is borrowing money from the brokers, believing that the market was going to go up forever. All right. In 1929, in October, Black Thursday, the market crashed.